Alright, there's a new Electro 4-star. Let's not pretend that we're surprised that I'm making a video about him. Hello, let me just start off this video by saying, thank God we actually learned our lesson from last year, because around this time last year, we had access to Aino's kit. And oh boy, everybody was absolutely on top of Aino and crying about how terrible of a unit she was, but then everybody used her for the entire year anyways. So thank God we're not repeating those same stupid mistakes, because this year we're getting Alyosha, a unit who definitely has a lot of similarities to Aino, and thankfully we're not getting that same negative backlash about him. In general, the reception that I've seen to Alyosha has been a lot kinder. People are recognizing him for the decently strong, free option that he is, but of course, this is a Mies video. I'm here to tell you why I think he's even better than people are giving him credit for. So let's just do a little talk about Alyosha before he releases. But before we get into anything deeper, let me talk to you about the official Genshin Impact Top-Up Center? What? Yeah, this video is sponsored by Hoyo's official Top-Up Center. No external website that wants your login information, no third-party sellers, and there's currently a deal running that makes buying from this shop better than buying in-game. If you click my link in the description or pinned comment, you get the same prices from the in-game shop, with additional bonuses for each individual order. Each purchase gets you an additional 8% Primogems, maxing out at 518 for the largest pack. Within the current period, you can get this bonus on up to 5 individual purchases. And there's a pretty clear graphic on page showing exactly how much of these bonuses you have used. Let me just go ahead and refresh my welkin here. I've checked my character, I've made sure the server is right, go through the payment process, and then seconds later, there it is in game. And in the mail, I can check that I've gotten my additional 8% primos. So if you're looking to pick up an Odette or an Arlecchino, and maybe some Alyoshas on the way, you can check out the link on screen or in the description or pinned comment to go to the official Top-Up Center, where you can get some extra value for the money you spend. Thank you to the official Top-Up Center for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to Alyosha. Of course, he isn't in game right now, so I am going to be using the other 4-star Electro Wolfboy to represent him, and I'll be cutting in some footage that I'm getting from other creator experience videos. Let's do a quick run over of his kit. First things first, Alyosha has an effect in his kit called a Hunter's Mark. The reason I'm talking about this before any of his active talents is because it can actually be applied by all of his active talents. Hitting his 4th normal attack applies a Hunter's Mark, hitting his skill applies a Hunter's Mark, and casting his burst applies a Hunter's Mark. He actually needs his C2 for his burst to apply Hunter's Mark, but I'm leaving this section in because it sounds snappy. The first time you apply a Hunter's Mark to an enemy, it doesn't do anything. It's only after you apply it a second time and activate it that you actually get an effect. After hitting a second time and activating it, you then get a 15-second long buff to your on-fielder's attack. This attack buff scales with the level of Alyosha's skill. At level 1, it starts at just 11.7%, bringing it to talent level 10, you max out at 21%, and then bringing it to 13, with his constellations, it maxes out at 25%. It does ask that you level his skill at least a decent amount, but I don't think it is necessarily worth the crown unless you plan on using Alyosha a lot. Even at maximum investment, 25% attack to your on-fielder is not a particularly large buff. I'm going to be crowning him myself, but you should be fine at talent level 9, where without his C3, which is his skill level constellation, you max out at 20% attack, and with his C3, you get 23.7% attack. And then his burst does some other interesting stuff. First things first, it does not apply the Hunter's Mark, but it does activate it. You can technically apply the Hunter's Mark with your normal attacks, but that takes a long time, so your general play pattern will be to apply it with the skill and activate with the burst. His burst utility is essentially split into 2 different parts. You have his taunt and you have his dog, Tugarin. Both of these abilities apply Electro once every 2 seconds and each have their own defensive utility. The taunt is of course a taunt. It draws the aggro of nearby enemies and makes it less likely for them to attack your on-fielder. I do want to take a little bit of a moment to actually highlight this taunt because I feel like people act as if a taunt isn't real defensive utility, and I have just not found that to be the case. I'd say most of the time a shield is stronger and more preferable to a taunt, but that doesn't make taunts absolutely worthless all on their own. I've been hearing a lot of people asking for Sandrone to get a shield in her premium team because she can kind of feel bad when she gets interrupted, and while a taunt doesn't have the same strength as a shield, it's generally a little bit weaker, it does have the same utility. Distracting enemies and forcing them to attack a random spot on the ground is going to make it so that they attack your on-fielder less and you get interrupted less. The taunt aspect of his burst and the electro that it applies are circle impact, but before you start complaining in my comments, that's a good thing. That's how taunts should be. If a taunt wasn't circle impact and it was attached to your active character, that would mean that it was constantly drawing enemies to attack your active character. It wouldn't serve the defensive purpose that a taunt normally does. So yes, its electro application is circle impact, but it's a taunt. It needs to be circle impact to serve its purpose. Additionally, the taunt isn't his only source of electro application. The dog also does electro application, and this is not circle impact. And if we dig into his ascension passives, we'll find out that Tugurin also has his own defensive utility. When Tugurin attacks, he will restore HP to the nearby active party member worth 120% of Alyosha's attack. That's not a crazy high scaling, but Alyosha also doesn't have very strict build needs. Very similar to Aino, he does very little personal damage of his own. On a level 10 burst, his taunts application does 130%, and Tugurin's attacks do 90%. Neither are particularly good scalings. And while his electro application is alright, it's not particularly good, and he also isn't the best at getting a bunch of reactions out of his burst. It's doable, there are some ways to squeeze extra damage out of Alyosha, but it's pretty clear that he is not designed to deal significant personal damage. And that makes it so that you're not building damage bonus, you don't really need to build crit all that badly unless he's on Fav Lance, which, to be fair, he is on Fav Lance a lot, but he doesn't have very many stats to build, and therefore he is able to stack attack and crank this 120% healing scaling a little bit higher. Pretty much the only thing he needs is energy, and he is the first unit, I think legitimately since Yoon Jin, that ascends with energy recharge. It's been years, they just forgot units could ascend energy recharge until now. His second ascension passive is supposed to be an increase to his personal damage. It gives him a little bit of damage bonus to his burst and skill based on his energy recharge, but we just went over. He's not really meant to deal damage. His scalings are pretty low, so this talent doesn't end up doing a whole lot. Then his final passive talent that we need to talk about to get the full rounded out idea of his kit, when he's in Radiant Stellar Conduct, so when you trigger a Stellar Conduct and your on-fielder is standing within its field, his Hunter's Mark additionally buffs the Stellar Conduct damage of your on-fielder by 20%. And with that, we have our full idea of Alyosha's kit. His skill applies a mark to enemies and generates energy for his burst, and then his burst activates the mark, triggering a buff for your on-fielder of up to 25% attack with a max leveled skill, and 20% Stellar Conduct damage bonus if you are in Stellar Radiance. And then it applies Electro off-field and has two defensive utilities. A taunt that has circle impacted Electro application, and Tugurin, his dog, which is not circle impact application, and it heals your on-fielder for a percentage of Alyosha's attack. He has a small buff to your on-fielder, he has two pieces of defensive utility within his burst, and he applies Electro off-field. Three utilities that, while they aren't particularly numerically strong, are very generically usable and provide a lot of comfort to any team that he's running. Now, just to round off of his kit, let's look at his constellations. C1 is an energy constellation. He gets 15 energy when nearby party members trigger an electro-related reaction. Obviously, very easy condition to meet. It makes his burst a little bit easier to get, but because he doesn't have to build any sort of stats to confer his buffs, and he doesn't really deal any personal damage, he ends up just stacking energy recharge anyways, and he doesn't have very many difficulties getting his burst. But that's not to say that this is a useless constellation. I think this will be very impactful in Stygian. He is a burst-reliant unit, and this constellation is going to make it a lot easier to get his burst on your first rotation. C2 extends the duration of his burst. By default, it lasts for 14 seconds. C2 extends it by another 6, up to 20 seconds. The secondary effect of it is also kind of confusing in the way that it's worded. It says that each time Tugurin attacks an opponent, he will apply a Hunter's Mark, but it also says that this effect does not activate existing hunting marks. But the base description of his burst says the exact opposite. If an opponent affected by the Hunter's Mark is hit, the Hunter's Mark will also be activated. So I'm kind of confused on the exact way that this works, but it should result in a few extra seconds on the duration of his burst, giving him some longer electro application, and it should extend the duration of his buff by a little bit. I can't exactly say how much. Potentially, it might make him able to buff attack for a full 35 seconds, but the way it's worded is kind of confusing, so I'm not going to say that for certain now. I'm just going to say it at least extends both his application and his buff to 20 seconds. C3 is skill levels. It increases the attack buff that he gives. It's a pretty negligible amount, but it is not a nothing constellation. C4 gives him some additional healing. Whenever his healing is triggered, he also heals the lowest health member of the team for 60% of his attack. This allows him to heal low health off-fielders, but if you don't have any low health off-fielders, it also increases the healing that your on-fielder gets if they are the lowest HP percentage in the team. C5 is burst levels. He doesn't do very much damage, so it's pretty meaningless. Oh, I guess I actually should have mentioned that extending the duration of his burst also gives him a little bit more personal damage, if that's what you're doing with him. And then C6 is a meaningful constellation. It allows him to stack his Hunter's Mark twice, increasing the buff for your on-fielder from a maximum of 25% attack and 20% stellar conduct damage to 50% attack and 40% stellar conduct damage. Additionally, when the stack count reaches 2, the on-fielder also gets 100 EM, and EM gives even more damage bonus to stellar conduct on-fielders. While I don't think this is a good constellation design, I do want to take a minute to defend it a little bit, because I feel like people are kind of blowing it out of proportion. It is a strong numerical increase, and it does greatly increase his buffing potential, but people are talking about it as if this is a necessary constellation to make him a functional unit, which is just not true at all. It doesn't unlock any sort of additional utility in his kit, it just increases the numbers that your team is doing. But this constellation is basically never going to be the difference between being able to clear content and not. It is a significant buff, but Hoyo basically never designs content around needing C6 4-stars. They've been designing a lot of 4-stars like this for the past year, where they get significant power increases at their C6s, but those C6s have never been necessary to clearing meaningful content. The only thing that they enable is allowing certain teams to challenge dire level content without further vertical investment in the 5-stars. But in general, content is far more designed around having specific C0 5-stars than having specific 4-stars at C6. Prune has a significant and powerful C6. Eatlawa has a significant and powerful C6. But even if you didn't have those C6s, that didn't prevent you from clearing any relevant content with Sibai or Varka. They were able to perform just fine into a lot of the content that they were intended to be played into, and even some of the content that they weren't intended to be played into. While those constellations did provide a significant increase to your team's DPS, your team's DPS being increased did not provide a significant change in the actual gameplay experience this past year. Yes, the number went up when you were testing the team in the DPS dummy, but when you were actually playing into actual designed endgame content, it is much harder to see the actual difference. Those C6s didn't enable your ability to clear in the first place, they only enabled faster clears, which, if that's what you are personally interested in, fine, I don't have a problem with that. But I feel like the only people who are significantly affected by this 4-star C6 design are people who specifically are playing the game to reduce their clear times in Stygian and pull around doing exactly that. People who are looking to clear in the first place, or people like me who are looking to do more creative clears, are able to make perfectly good use of lower constellation 4-stars. So, now that that tangent's out of the way, yes, Alyosha C6 is a significant spike that does increase his buffing potential, and I personally don't like that his earlier constellations are a lot smaller increases, and his C6 is where most of his constellation power was held. But I feel like we are really overblowing how impactful C6 Alyosha really is, and how much of a meaningful difference it will make in the content that he is played into. Now let's go back to talking about C0 0. This kit being highly functional and easy to use, but not particularly numerically impressive, has garnered Alyosha a reputation as being a nice free-to-play option. If you don't have Yaimiko, you can run Alyosha, and you're going to be dealing less damage, but it won't feel actively bad to play. He has some buffs, he has some application, he has some defensive utility. Even with constellations, he doesn't become a particularly standout unit. But hey, this is a Mies video. I'm here to tell you that even if you do have the premium options for stellar teams, you might still end up using Alyosha. Because while a lot of people are being kinder to him than they were to Aino, because I think they realize that the context in which we need to judge Alyosha is different from other units. He is a free 4-star that everybody gets access to without having to pull. There is a guaranteed method of getting an Alyosha, and he is extremely unreliant on his constellations to be a functional unit. So while he isn't a big DPS increase, even with those constellations, he at least is a very functional unit with a strong role. So while he's not the best, we at least have to give him some credit for being so accessible and so functional. But I still think that those videos that say that Alyosha is only a good option if you don't have the premium options kind of miss the point. I still feel like they're approaching the game from kind of a bad angle, because we're not playing DPS Dummy Simulator, we're playing Genshin Impact. There isn't any sort of in-game content that requires you to play the team with the highest DPS potential on your account. What there is content that requires you to have multiple built teams to challenge it. Because of things like Stygian, Aino wasn't only a unit that you use if you don't have Columbina, she's a unit that you use because there aren't 2 Columbinas. Sometimes Hoyo makes content that wants you to have multiple available teams from the new archetype, and having a lot of options available for those teams can be a valuable thing. Alyosha isn't going to be a unit that you use just because you don't have Yai. Alyosha is going to be a unit that you use because there's only one Yai. While Alyosha doesn't have the best numbers, he does have a very functional kit with some nice generic utilities, and he is extremely accessible and not reliant on constellations, just like Aino. And people who got Columbina this year still used Aino because Hoyo put out content like this, and Aino was still one of the most comfortable and easily accessible options. Additionally, I feel that it's really easy to make a case for using Alyosha over his counterparts. The main 5 that I'm going to go over are 3 5-stars in Chi-Chi, Escoffier, and Yaimiko, and 2 4-star counterparts of Beidou and Diona. And I'll start with the most direct comparison I think that you can make in Chi-Chi. Both Chi-Chi and Alyosha do fairly similar things. They don't do very much personal damage. Chi-Chi can be built to do a little bit of damage with her burst, but it's not massive, and they both have decent application, decent defensive utility, and a little bit of buffing. Of course, the main case that you can make against any 3 of these units is that they are 5-stars and Alyosha is not. Yaimiko and Escoffier are limited units that have to be pulled, and Chi-Chi is a standard unit, so she can be a little bit easier to get, but there's no guarantee that you can lose to Chi-Chi at any given time. We do have the standard selector coming up in 7.1, but Hoyo has balanced Mizuki very favorably, and I think they did that in an attempt to try to control which unit people would be selecting from the standard selector. Mizuki is a fairly strong on-fielder and is likely going to be pretty competitive with the upcoming limited Stellar Swirl on-fielders. So while Chi-Chi is a nice and comfortable option to have for stellar teams, it's going to be hard to make a case to pick her over Mizuki if you don't have either. So while you can get a Chi-Chi from the selector, a lot of people aren't going to be. Additionally, Chi-Chi and Alyosha are different elements. Not only is Genshin Impact a game that has content that wants you to have multiple teams built to challenge it, it's a game that designs its characters and enemies around wanting specific elements. Even if Alyosha is a numerically weaker unit than Chi-Chi, there are going to be situations where you want to run him for his element, whether that is an enemy that wants you to run Electro, or the way he slots into a particular team that wants Electro. So then you say, okay, well, Yae Miko is also an Electro unit. She can do a lot of the same things that Alyosha can do, but she also does a ton of personal damage. And that's true, but unlike Chi-Chi and Escoffier, Yae doesn't have any defensive utility. Yae doesn't heal. Yae doesn't taunt. Alyosha does. Not only does that make him valuable as a comfort option, but there are also checks in the game that ask you to bring a healer. There were the Radiant Beasts that came out this year. There's often a stage in Imaginarium that drains your team's health and wants you to bring a healer. Even though Yae does more damage in a neutral context, Genshin doesn't really have neutral context. They always try to incentivize you to bring something. And Alyosha, being the element that he is and having the utilities that he does, makes it so that he can slot into these teams and meet certain conditions better than any other unit. And let me go back to my first point, even if him having these utilities doesn't specifically make him best in slot, like the Radiant Moon Beasts do provide a healing check, but the elite enemy variants provide a much smaller debuff than the boss variants. I think it's only minus 30 crit rate and maybe 20% damage bonus. My point is that the Radiant Beasts are brute forceable. You can ignore their mechanic and just kill them before getting rid of the debuff anyways, but every single piece of endgame in this game requires you to bring multiple teams. Abyss has 2 sides, Stygian has 3 bosses, Imaginarium doesn't even let you enter the higher difficulties unless you have enough units built. Maybe he's not always best in slot, and maybe his utilities aren't enough to bring him on par with the more higher damage units, but even that doesn't matter because every piece of endgame wants you to have multiple built teams. You cannot always use your best in slot teams, so you might as well be building these comfort options. Because, oh yeah, maybe they don't cheat as high, but they do allow you to have flexibility and actually challenge the content that is in the video game. You don't get any Primogems for spreadsheeting, guys. And I don't think that this game is all about getting Primogems. I think that if all you play Genshin Impact for is the rewards, I don't think that's very healthy. I think you should be playing games because you have fun with those games, whatever way that is. That can be up to you. But every single piece of endgame in this game is constantly asking that you have multiple teams built, that you have multiple options to be able to deal with shills or just have enough units to get through the door in the first place. To pretend that Alyosha is nothing but a nice free-to-play option is kind of silly, because even the people who pulled Columbina still ended up using their Ainos a lot. I can absolutely attest to that this year. Aino was a vital unit on my account for several Stygians, for several Imaginariums, for several Abysses. Even though I had the premium options, Aino was still valuable, and Alyosha is a lot less directly comparable to his counterparts than Aino is to Columbina. Anyways, I mentioned those 2 4-stars and then I didn't even talk about them, because while I think people overblow the value of Alyosha C6, and I think that that's kind of silly, but I do kind of get where it's coming from. But what I can't understand is how someone can call Alyosha C6 reliant and then turn around and laugh at him because he is a so-called Beidou side grade. If anybody is reliant on their C6s here, it's Beidou! Both Beidou and Diona did get some buffs to make them both into functional stellar supports, but unlike Alyosha, who has some buffing in his base kit and has improved buffing at C6, both of these units have literally 0 buffs at C0 to C5. All of their buffs are within their C6s. That is a much more restrictive design, and while you can make the case that both Beidou and Diona are older units, and there are more people who are going to have their C6s than Alyosha's C6, they also are not particularly good units, and they haven't been rerun very much recently. So people who joined the game in the past few years might also be out on Beidou's and Diona's. They might be stuck with a C3 Diona, or a C1 Diona, or maybe no Diona at all. And while Alyosha is a DPS side grade to these units when they all have access to their C6s, he handily beats both Diona and Beidou out at all other levels of investment. He does much more relevant things than either of them at C0, and out of the three of them, he's the one that's permanently free. And of course, they're all different units. They all do different things. Both Diona and Beidou have shields, which in a neutral context, I think it's a slightly better defensive utility than Alyosha has, but like I just said, we don't really have neutral contexts in Genshin. Sometimes shields are shield, and Diona and Beidou might be better, and sometimes healing is shield, and Alyosha will be better. They have different utilities, they have different use cases. I'm gonna have all three of them built, but honestly, if you don't have any of them built, I would argue that Alyosha is the most valuable out of the three of them. They are going to want to be used in different use cases. So there we go. Rant over. I'm happy that people are giving Alyosha some credit. They are recognizing the mistakes that they made judging Aino's value, and they are correcting for that, and they are giving Alyosha a little bit more credit. But frankly, I still think it's not enough, because I think overwhelmingly people try to evaluate Genshin units in neutral contexts when overwhelmingly, Genshin doesn't make neutral content. Every Abyss, every Imaginarium, every Stygian wants different things and tries to push you into investing into different units. And having a unit that fills a similar role but has different strengths to other units is a valuable thing. Anyways, I'm going to finish this off just by quickly going over some gear choices and then talk about some teams. This isn't going to be incredibly thorough, I'm just kind of going to be spitballing here. Let's use Yan-san as our placeholder here because, oh my god, guess what? They have the same signature weapon. Yeah, Alyosha is pretty much going to be perma-locked on Fab on most accounts. He doesn't do very much personal damage, it helps him get his burst a little bit easier, and of course, it's Fab. It's one of the only polearms that can provide significant supportive value. I don't think there are many other 4-star weapons that are worth talking about all that much. Moonpiercer has some supportive value. It drops a leaf that buffs attack when you trigger a Dendro reaction. He doesn't currently run in very many Dendro teams, but we might be getting some more Dendro stuff down the road, and in that case I think Moonpiercer could be an interesting option. If you don't have a Fav, I guess you can craft either Katane or Prototype Starglitter as a placeholder until you do get your hands on a Fav, but I wouldn't get many refines on either. And the final weapon to be mentioned is Escoffier's signature, the Fork. Whenever the equipper triggers healing, the unit that's healed gets 24% attack. Alyosha has pretty decent consistent healing. He's able to get this passive fairly easily. It gives him a little bit more buffing potential. And as for artifact sets, I am pretty much going to be permanently keeping him on Noblesse. It's not his only option, but it's what he's going to be running in his most optimized stellar teams. It is a very, very flexible set for a relatively flexible unit. It just is a good default. It gives him a little bit more buffing potential. He needs to cast his burst to do all of the things that he wants to do, so Noblesse is a pretty free inclusion. And I know people are going to be asking about the new Stellar Conduct supportive set. It's possible to use it on him, but it's not always going to be easy. It either requires you to deal stellar reaction damage, which he can't, or it requires you to trigger a stellar reaction, which is easier. If you get a Cryo Aura on your opponent and then Alyosha applies Electro, he'll get a Stellar Conduct, but it might cause some minor difficulties, and there are often other members in his teams that are already equipping that set. His other options are going to be a lot more team dependent. I personally am going to try to use him with Flints, and in those teams, Serenade is an option on him. I think Scroll is a pretty similar option to Noblesse. He can use it. Any unit in the game can use Scroll as long as you're playing a team that appreciates the damage bonus that it gives. Although I would generally prioritize Noblesse. He would only really go Scroll if you have another unit in the team that's already using Noblesse, or if you're running a team that can't make use of the attack that Noblesse gives, which is basically exactly what I would say about Instructors. Another option that technically works on him, but I would generally prioritize Noblesse unless another unit is using it or the team that you're playing can't use the attack. I've been getting a lot of questions about Tenacity, and no, please for the love of God, do not put him on Tenacity. His skill hits one time. It is a one-hit ability. It only does damage on cast. His burst is the ability that does damage over time. He cannot make use of Tenacity. Please don't do that to him. And then I guess he has a damaging option in Emblem, but he just doesn't deal enough personal damage to ever justify putting him on emblem. This is only really something that you do if you like Alyosha and you want him to be dealing more personal damage. Oh, and actually I just remembered, because he heals, he also can make use of Song of Days Past. And the same thing that I said about every other set also applies here. You can use it, but I wouldn't unless you can't use the attack or somebody else is on noblesse. Now, let's just do some light talk about teams that I think he might be interesting in. We're also just pretending that Shenhe is Odette here. Most obvious use case is for Stellar Conduct teams. He applies Electro off field, and obviously Stellar Conduct teams like that a lot. They want to consistently be triggering a Stellar Conduct reaction. There's a mechanic where it tallies up the amount of elemental hits that your entire team has done and gives you a buff that increases your Stellar Conduct damage based off of that. Between his taunt and his dog, he hits fairly frequently. He's going to be able to be a decent stack generator, although that is a context in which his taunt and its application, being Circle Impact, can affect your team's damage, but like I said before, it's a taunt. It wouldn't work if it wasn't Circle Impact. Also, part of his buffs are specifically in Stellar Conduct damage bonus. 20% at C0, 40% at C6, so if you want to make the most use of his kit, you want to be using a Stellar Conduct on-fielder. Not really much to say about this beyond that, it's just his intended archetype. Although I know people are having some concerns about Wriothesley, so let me talk about him for a second. In Stellar Conduct, Wriothesley is unable to get his enhanced Stellar Charge attack unless he drops below 60% HP, meaning if you want to get this enhanced charge attack, you aren't able to run him with strong healers. But he still is able to run with Alyosha because he kind of has two ways around this. Yes, this Stellar Charge attack does do a significant amount of damage, but it's not his only source of Stellar Conduct damage. He also converts two of his normal attacks into Stellar Conduct damage, and even if you are getting consistently healed and you never drop below 60% health and get that charge attack, he still does get very significant Stellar Conduct damage. It is worse, but it still should be pretty good. I'd say it's a little bit more impactful if you have his C1. His C1 gives some specific damage bonuses. When you hit with his 5th normal attack, he gives a 50% damage bonus buff to his Stellar Charge attack, and vice versa. When he hits with his Stellar Charge attack, he gives a 50% damage bonus buff to his 5th normal. So, if he isn't doing Stellar Charge attacks, then this constellation becomes completely useless. His 5th normal gives a buff that he can't use, and he can't get access to the buff that actually affects his 5th normal. But luckily, it's still not completely over. If you want to run Wriothesley and Alyosha together and you have Wriothesley C1, you still have a way of making that happen. Because the scaling on Alyosha's healing isn't particularly fantastic, but furthermore, there are a lot of ways that you can minimize it. Because his healing scales on attack, you can throw him on a level 1 weapon to reduce his base attack as much as you possibly can. You can avoid attack percent in your artifacts. Because the only thing in Alyosha's kit that he wants to be building for is getting his burst and then getting a little bit of extra healing, you don't really lose anything at all by minimizing his attack as much as you possibly can to minimize the healing that he does. If Alyosha is on that level 1 weapon and you don't have many full party attack buffs going on and you don't have much attack in your artifacts, he will do very little healing and Wriothesley will still be able to comfortably drop his HP below 60% and get his enhanced charge attack. I already mentioned flints when I was talking about artifacts, but I think that Alyosha is going to be a neat option for Flint's teams. He definitely has access to much higher damaging teams, he has much more synergistic teammates, but he also has the issue of not really having good defensive Electro units outside of Anefa. Alyosha provides some good front-loaded energy generation, he can trigger some extra lunar charge reactions, he of course gives his attack buff, and at C6 that buff is increased, and he also gives EM, which is still a valuable stat to Flint's. I have Ino here, but I honestly think that Alyosha is going to be a particularly compelling unit to people who have Flint's and Columbina and not Anefa. Because of what I mentioned, he doesn't really have good defensive options outside of Anefa, and Alyosha is a good alternative option that provides some offensive buffs. Minor ones at C0, they become more relevant at C6. In the same note, I mentioned Nefer. Nefer is somewhat lacking in defensive options, and Alyosha can be a nice one. I think he'll provide an effective option for Electro Varka. When we're talking about Varka in the upcoming patch, way more focus is on Stellar Swirl Varka. He's gotten some good new Cryo teammates that make his Cryo teams significantly better, but I don't want to completely ignore his Electro teams. This is probably the most scuffed thing that I'm going to end up talking about today, because Electro Varka still isn't going to be made fantastic through Alyosha. But once again, Electrovarka lacks defensive options. Alyosha is going to provide one. He is also going to provide some amount of buffing, whereas someone like Fischl, who does have decent personal damage, her hex-related buffs are reliant on you triggering specific reactions, and you can't trigger those reactions in Varka teams. So her value for Electrovarka is a lot lower. You might want to free her up for another team. I have continually been asked about Aggravate, which... Sure, I guess. Don't get me wrong, there is some sort of synergy here. It's just that Aggravate has been a little bit left behind. He also doesn't get the most aggravates himself. I think I've been asked this because people see that he doesn't have very good scaling himself, so they want to use Aggravate to squeeze more damage out of Alyosha, but he also just doesn't have the best application. He doesn't trigger the most aggravates. Once every 2 seconds is just not that much. But he can get a little bit of personal damage here, and his buffs are going to affect the team. Fischl can snapshot his attack buffs, and of course at C6 he starts giving EM. A lot of units that trigger aggravates are actually attack scalers. At a baseline, Tiknari is an attack scaler, Cyno is an attack scaler, Chlorand is an attack scaler, and also the EM buff. There are a few characters that have synergy with EM in their base kits. Both Tiknari and Cyno get a little bit of extra damage bonus and scaling, respectively, from EM. It'll be functional, at least worth mentioning. And I think the last team that I want to talk about is sort of a funny thing that just kind of came out of nowhere. While a lot of units got some significant damage upgrades from the combination of Nicole and Durin, it's kind of ironic that Mr. Mono Pyro himself didn't really get that, because while you would think this is a very synergistic team, you got 3 pyro units, so he's maxing out his mono pyro passive and he's getting the maximum damage bonus from it, and you're getting a lot of good buffs. Durin is doing his own personal damage and shredding res, Nicole has attack and damage bonus, and she gives a shield, which Linny is a really big fan of. But Linny has one final restriction to maximizing his damage. He consumes his own HP when firing off charge shots to get him stacks on his skill and to do a little bit of extra damage with his hats that he summons, and he consumes HP way faster than he can heal himself. So ideally you want to be running him with a healer so he can always be consuming HP with his prop arrows. And until now, we didn't really have a unit that could fit comfortably in the last slot. Number 1, you need a healer, and number 2, you need a unit that has off-field application of another element so that Durin can get his res shred from triggering reactions. And until Alyosha came along, we didn't really have a unit that fit that exact criteria. I feel like Linny is such a hyper-specific unit that it feels like he's constantly getting these weird, out-of-left-field upgrades to his teams, and lo and behold, it's happened again. Alyosha is genuinely Linny's best last slot teammate. Alright, that's, I think, all I want to talk about today. Thank you to my channel members: Najado Rompaltos, Mudkip, Beef Potato, Roberto, Desu, Big Soup, Buffalo Milk, DB, Bab, TSI Mott, Smoothie, Tylee, Juicy Jeepers, Nachita Smile, AJ Jordan Draws, Starnova, Padevan, Mr. The Teams, Just Kiana, Crystal, Aqua, Anime King, and Tayday. Thank y'all for your continued support. Really appreciate it through these months. I hope you learned something. Have a lovely day.